In the Darkness I See by Anon Y. Chapter 2. My Time in Peru. Part 1. My visit to Peru, of keystone importance, began and ended in the cool month of July, in a misty rainforest retreat. My lovely escape was surrounded by plush forest, uncharted by most, and just a couple of miles outside of Iquitos. The foggy mornings, each and all, failed not in transfixing me, their delightful combined grandeur propelling me further out of myself with each iteration. The morning mists moved like molasses through the mountains, capturing all within their cooling power. The repeat engulfings took a hold of my mind and captivated my senses. Although all-encompassing and intensely voluminous, the fogs were consistently peaceful, never harming anything in direct contact. The slow absorptions of landscape into the masses seemed to silver my soul. My admiration was not drawn directly from the picturesque quality of the brooding brooms looming lavishly atop the trees. It was their symbolic meaning that intrigued me. The plumes of invigorating vapor, those amorphous majesties, moved like universes, their hydrating impetuses forcing them across the valley, into the town, and through my dwelling, every morning, without fail. The hazy conglomerations were not just continuums of water droplets, representatives of the dynamic nature of densities and pressures. They were units of time incarnated. Each installation of heavenly hydrating, dynamic appellation was familiar to me somehow as, no matter how structured, organized, or stunning the pre-misted vista had been, the gallant trot of moist time came in to rivet all its anti-victims and engross them with its diaphanous embrace. From those incidences, I was able to distill the quintessential message of life and death. The locals called it La Garua. I called it my beginning rebirth. Although I had instantly found Peru, and assumptively all of South America, alluringly beatific, I had not visited Peru for the pulchritudinous peering. I was there for a spiritual awakening. Through the Andean trunk, Bolivia, Peru, Ecuador, Colombia, and Venezuela, and with the aid of some people in the know, I had cartographically and multivernacularly searched and lettered and found and frenzied traveled off with an intensity that only a middle-aged man without a family could have mustered. The long-standing concentrations of ritualistic tribes that celebrated the use of a certain hallucinogenic tonic had been found and was now within my grasp. What polar transformative thoughts I would have after thinking such a thing. The mixture was made mainly from the ayahuasca plant, most directly translated to vine of the dead, and yet I was so sure that it was to revivify me. As I taxied and walked towards the shaman, I repeatedly read the note that a gentleman named Amos Katz had given to me months before. The damp and panic-softened note read as follows. The ayahuasca vine, mixed with chacruno leaves to aid in the metabolization of the vine, will drive your heart into the jungle and out from yourself. This bountiful beverage allows you to enter the realms of palpable perception only reserved for deep sleep. After all, the human body at rest is said to synthesize a minuscule amount of the main psychedelic component in ayahuasca called N,N-dimethyltryptamine, or DMT. Inconclusive as this idea may be, you will see soon enough that dreamscapes must be the result of this synthesis and its rampaging synaptic gap reactions, or something strikingly similar. So, with DMT, the dreams and their lessons come up from the darkness and grasp your awake reality. There is no more hiding from behind your mind once you find yourself in the vine. To actualize my modern prejudices' lasting protective suspicions, I spent an unspecial span of the morning before finalizing my journey towards the transcendental, ineffectively whisper-recounting some shard of wisdom I had surely half plagiarized. "In order to earnestly call myself academically honest," I grumbled, "it is imperative to first-hand test these ideations that I have so willingly shared with my peers." I suppose that at least half of that sentiment was mine by way nuance, because in my much younger years I had written a small thesis titled "The Confrontation of PTSD with the Use of Psychedelic Pharmaceuticals." Within my research, I had discovered the revolutionary capacity of the substance. Almost all of the usually troubled subjects to whom the DMT had been administered revealed either decreased PTSD symptomologies or increased overall life satisfaction. Most of the subjects ended their time with both of those positive outcomes integrated into their brains functioning and their souls recording as a result of an entirely new perspective on life, and more importantly, more potently, death. It had taken many years to muster the courage to brave the unsure waters of my unconscious mind, but there I was, on my way. My partaking in the ceremony had not been fully activated by my study of the field, but rather by my Jungle Notes writer, my good friend Amos Katz. What a strange night our first meeting had been. I reminisced about Amos as I began the final stretch of walking towards my end-begotten re-beginning, intermediately reaching still for my folded advisory. That night of eruptive collision grew in providentially destined obviousness and in thickly entrancing clarity with each thought backwards, the jungle densifying concurrently. Strangely, what my mind found most readily worthy of remembrance within that first meeting, in the belly of our shared musky social club, was our most initial confused confrontation, with Amos lounging languidly across the beaded leather couch, and I his oddly mislabeled servant. I remembered his wafery hand as it beckoned me over, and, as if magnetized like cold iron to charged pole, I strode nervously towards him. Instantaneously, even before our anonymity had dissipated, I felt a special uneasiness, his grey hair and tight features standing in high direct contrast. His face, neither particularly attractive nor symmetrical, drew me in as though it had been painted by Rayburn himself. The first words spoken were too unpredictable to be unplanned. "Another bourbon," robustly ordered Amos. "Under Katz. That's my usual." I knew that a man of my stature was never to have been known to become flustered or bombastic in the face of such scrutiny, equal members of the social club as we surely were. Against my Russian root's best judgment, I had to recompose myself. In my comporting self properly preparation, I first dulled my completely conflicting duality with a desperate application of Occam's razor. Secondarily, to reduce the questions rapier-like rawness reveal, showing heavily in my troubled face, turned into one big, angered wrinkle, I methodically tested and readied my retort, ensuring response deliverance by way of civility that only an indisputably mature prefrontal cortex could manage. The problem of the situation, as I knew it, was not only that a singular sentence, a series of 7 words, 13 syllables, could castrate me into self-castigation, but that the coming clarification was to reveal only more about me and my needs than the initial, hopefully misplaced order. One sentence to truly test my hollow self-perception. Although I had spent many, misapprehended as effortful years, emboldening my sense of masculinity and deliverance from the peaceful tranquility of my little corners, in the shadows of my consciousness, I had truly frozen in my moment of inglorious confrontation. In his question, drained of all deference, I had receded expeditiously into the same cavern from which my pride and ego had been falsely derived. With such ease he had nimbly uprooted and deconstructed my tenacious desire to be a respected member of my tribe, the intellectuals. I was the stupid little immigrant boy once again, stripped of all my vapid vitality. He had served me to myself. Worst of all, I was unsure if he had simply succumbed to an unfortunate mischaracterization, or if he was vindictively targeting me. Thus, my reactionary rebuttal was an uncertain path forward. I replied to Amos, first nameless to me, with much angry disillusionment. "I am not a server here," I stated, almost shouting. His reply was even more troubling, saying, "Another bourbon, please." I rejected his raised glass and stumbled off, fuming. Later on that evening, when the gleeful cheer of pretentious camaraderie had faded, and almost everyone except for Amos and I had evacuated back to their lives, wives, or archives, he wandered over to my little nook. Within the room's most discreet crevice, where I felt most comfortable, I dwelled gloomily. The simple trouble of that evening had scrambled my mind and cut through all the drivel and banter of the Requiem Social Club. All my necessary grey matter was totally devoted to the conquering of my opponent without further confrontation. I had read all of Aquinas, Frankl, Jung, and Nietzsche. I had understood and preached to my clients about the urgency of self-attribution of struggle and the integration of one's own overcoming spirit to the point of perfunctorization. But at my own real testing point of becoming a beguiling maestro of mastered violence and acerbic straightforwardness, I became trapped within the smallest version of myself. Übermensch I was not. Once Amos had situated himself across from me in the booth, I hastened to rectify his interpretation of me. Because my restrained demeanor could have signaled weakness to him, I made sure to clarify my position and close the seemingly open invitation to trample my pride. In other words, I was unwilling, to communicate my message of war within the confines of composed, unvulgar prose. And so, with the predictability of a janitor at midnight, I began assailing him from my shadowy corner. Simultaneously, I inchwise revealed the intensity of my tensing body, using more and more of the dull alcoholic light's intensity to mean as much as involuntarily possible. Each of my pejoratives projected was a spear into the heart of whom I had convinced myself Amos was or would become given time. As I increasingly asserted myself, he remained unmoved. His damp stare was like that of a naughty child. Piercing through my verbal onslaught with the devilish glimmer of a smile, Amos seemed satisfied with our shared unease. In that moment, my verbal prowess could have been that of a clairvoyant, approximating perfect preciseness and punctiliousness, and it still would have been futile in deconstructing his pride, as I had wished by decree of decimated mine. Eventually, the second intellectual battle, another predictor of many to come between but entangle us, was waged and won, the victor clear after another small bout of syllables. His concise words, no embellishments, stood fast and firm. "You respect your elders, don't you?" That conglomeration of soundful meanings, almost crystalline with its piercing effect, so effortless in construction, silenced me again. That moment was the inception of the game that we played, the morally virtuous game, with no real winner ever revealed, just a meticulous dance of mental agility. The search for the truly superior thinker, and thus the better man, began. I was never too weary of the assiduous ambition lying beneath all men's hearts, betwixt their mothers and fathers, their brothers and sisters, intertwined with passion and courage. So the game bothered me little. The drive for the preeminence over all combatants coursed through us. We had both climbed the intellectual ladder and become true scholars. Bored of our ascension, we desired a move from a physical realm to an essential one, most manifestations of the former needing not much more than nous and simple expressionism to subsume its nuances into boring trivialities. We wanted pure sage wisdom. Our heightened, combining adversarial intellect eventually became a visceral roughness between us. It was, however, as inconsequential as two Neanderthals back and forth beating. We sat on, groveling not over food or mating rights, but rather over things of less apparent importance, and so surely thusly we spoke like gold miners awaiting our nuggets of truth. Though we both understood the futility of our uncompromising biology, our vestigial prefrontal simplicity gripped us tightly. Deep within the inner functionality of our brains and their underlying chemistries, our drive for domination swelled in each other's presence. After my first annihilation had been made clear to me, and my newly found teacher had become most comfortable, I accepted semi-defeat and silently set up my comprehensive drainage system of discourse deconstruction and additive translation, running in that nifty back-of-front mind of mine. I was ready to filter all the understandings and pontifications that would fall out of his mouth. Through my conscious and unconscious biases and refutations, they journeyed. After a few hours and some linguistic lubrication, we got along just fine. After all the shallow theorizations had come and been concluded, we began discussing the real reason for us being at a social club at 1:30 in the morning. We remained, lost souls seemingly damned to become unforgiven voyagers traveling to the unknown with no compass. He abruptly asked, "What is your current standing on the religious and spiritual beliefs held within the context of the Western world today?" "How to begin to answer that?" I retorted. Well, it is an unimportant question to those who can surpass the derivation of value through a morally reductive lens. That question, beautifully grandiose, is the perfect distraction for those who cannot ascend the ranks of comprehension and discover the circular reasoning behind moral virtue. Frustrated, he leaned back and questioned, "Circular reasoning?" I recapitulated, firmly saying, "The morals of the traditional Judeo-Christian belief system, so acclaimed and adhered to, are basic human tendencies towards non-zero-sum community structures. We simply self-serve through a common mediator. Hence, that determination that we are good because God is inside of all of us truly means that God is good because he is made up of us all, making God a definitionally human construct. The circular reasoning comes at the expense of justified morality. We are good as defined by the God our goodness defines. While yes, the success of this ethos creates a successful society and culture insofar as it explains the inexplicable complexity of IQ and above-self abstraction, and that achievement further strengthens the efficacious nature of its own translational commanding common mediating system, deemed supreme, it fails as we explain away the mystery. My reference, you may ask? How about the last 150 years or so? All who reap the rewards of triumphant peace espouse the virtue of God. In actuality, these peacetimers champion the fulfillment of a mutually beneficial mediation machine. Furthermore, according to most interpretations of the Scriptures, we are here to please God. This is the God that we have refined from the battle between the good and evil residing within all of us. All in all, we are pleased when emboldening the holiness within ourselves, leading back to the self-service we tried desperately to escape. His response was short and sweet, quickly huffing and shouting, "Another!" As I began translating another one of my thoughts into speech, I was interrupted again by him. "Not you," he corrected. He held up his drink. The barman, on his way out, took the glass and politely asked us to leave. I was hooked. It was no longer a game of fluctuating supremacy, makeable possible. He was the master, and I his humble student. Rather confusing was that instant relationship. There was no degree of merit that he held over me, no discernible difference in wit or aptitude, and yet some fabrication from my ancient brain told me to respect him and seek his approval. More obvious conclusions could have been drawn, such as a desire for a secondary father figure to strengthen my emaciated paternal linkage, or perhaps a redirected urge for connection that my sexual promiscuity failed to fulfill. Those conclusions were both confronted and categorized as peripheral to my amazement of his ineffable blithe. He always remained rigidly sharp in tongue and thought, but so relaxed and demure in temperament. He was indescribably alluring. From that evening on, we made it a habit to meet up and discuss the objective truth behind all things. Rather, I would try to impress him with some modern approach to psychological evaluation, connecting it with problematic assertions made by the greats, and he would listen, grunt, and fail to be impressed. On one such occasion, in my exercise of imagination, I incorporated the teachings of B.F. Skinner with the ponderances of Empedocles. With all its girth, I had to write it out on a napkin before speaking it into half-truth. First, I wrote Empedocles' description of perception, and then, simultaneously scribbling, I mumble exalted, as a transient flow of energy through pores, as he calls them, and sensory organs, as well as his later description of the life force energy traveling through the cosmos, coincides perfectly with Skinner's thoughts on the biological sensations as being of chief import. His response to that exuberant theory was as blasé as ever, grumbling, "Lovely theory, but much trouble comes to those who find solace in others' minds." We continued in the same sophisticated aimlessness for the remainder of the night. Again and again I researched and discussed the intricacies of such theories. Each time I delivered a perfectly crafted message to demonstrate my worthiness. His answers inevitably spoken with defiance and an unimpressed tone, almost consumptive of nothing but consistency, taking my contributions out at the knees and unveiling my shallow rectitude. Within the polar lights of another night, I recall comparing the likes of Maslow and Aristotle, or perhaps Plato. Ah, yes, it was Plato. I recall even my mispronunciation of Plato as our dwarf-labeled planetoid. You say Pluto, I remember joking. I say Plato. Platato, Plutato, Platoto, Plutoto. We both laughed meagerly into hysterically at that, sharing in much pain. My hurt was generated by the lingering shame of potential shattered perception brought about by my pickled tongue's switching of person and planet, and his was made from his great knowing of his power over me, way over there. We brushed off the momentary proof of truth in clarity, and I continued mining myself free of all other associated categorizations of science, humans, and living things. I droned on for hours, and he simply gifted one or two reactions of substance, with a faint smile only worn by him under the zeroed scruples of truly remarkable discoveries echoed between my just more than tongue and cheek. Fluttering through the empty space between us, sparks flew. Eventually, I gave in, saying, "Why and how do such things not call for some semblance of recognition within you? No outright additions can be made to my assertions without traveling through time, digging up ancient relics, and conducting intricate investigation, of which neither of us have time. I have read all that humanity has. I have examined all there is to know from the greatest minds, and yet nothing comes from you. Why?" With his fine half-grown smile finally broken done, he elaborated. "I spent much time doing the same things as you," he whispered. "So faux graciously too, you see. I listed off all that I knew, and nothing met me halfway. It all led me back to the same empty crevasse. Using that methodology, that one you used today, right now, right here, after countless sleepless nights, I found myself at the top of the Park Imperial building, 10:30 in the morning. Nothing but a whispery gust was needed to propel my body into the infinite jaws of the unknown. No truth was ever grand enough to fill me with the peace I ventured to capture. It was then that I learned that peace is not to be subjugated by us at all. Peace is for those who... Perhaps you are not ready. We fell silent for some time, my sub-face cringing at his end statement's unoriginality, but my soul dancing to know him. Regretting my initial probe, I asked what had pulled him to safety, off that building of his. After composing his thoughts, he returned to his retelling. There it was, he said, across the way, my exact sofa, owned by someone else. Marvelously crafted by Lionel Gravelli, with its perfect bust and understated accent pillows like fluffed pristinity. It was just sitting there, looking at me. A woman was there too, in the wide window-framed painting, boisterously draped over it, restlessly writhing in its embrace. It called to me to revisit my warm apartment one last time. What forestalled your return to that ledge? I asked with frenzied curiosity. As the last of my question hit him, and I panned from his right eye to all around his face, informationally absorptive my glare, I noticed his demeanor had been drastically dulled. I couldn't believe it. He had actually been drained from the retelling, his face's usual light sheen cleaned free. Sadness, an emotion I had not seen from him before, was wearing him like an overcoat. It was only when I returned home, he continued, from those brisk strides with death that I realized my life's next act. I sank myself into my perfect sofa, now not so potent as had been reverse portentously self-convinced prophesied, and, as comfortably as a newborn upon breast, I read the newspaper. I took in first the daily crime column. Its heading was like a diamond in sunlight, reading, "New drug DMT, roots in South America." From that paper I was provided with a regimented list of DMT effects, and into the search for more I was pulled. I read additional studies from my alma mater where I learned of the ancient origins of the drug. It was never made for recreation. It was consumed to align the soul with the world, a reconciliation with one's more than own identity. I booked a trip to Peru that same week, and, with the help of my shaman Alberto, I discovered myself. As soon as I took that DMT, I tell you, Mark, I tell you, there was the answer to my dilemma. In that moment, I was more than an intellectual or teacher. I was the embodiment of exploration. I was nothingness, and then something, and then humanity, and then myself, and then I was everything. And then there was nothing called then. Amos's eyes ran dark, and red wine dripped clear down his face as he continued. Back to a fluctuating whisper of cognized reality still, he opined on, crying, "The magnetization to that place had been so intense. I finally understood why." He followed by letting himself loose, crying out through the tears into that dark and empty bar, at and through me. "I want to go back. There's nothing here for me but that couch. Oh, that dreadful couch." After his tears had dried, he explained to me why he could never return, for his trip had not ended in Peru. From there, Amos had ventured north to Colombia, where, as growingly predictable as he was swelling to be in my searingly watery eyes, he had become involved with a certain problematic powder, as he childishly called it. He had found his heart, and then had decided to false fill it. After traveling over the border, back to his original taste of divinity, the Peruvian government seized him and his drugs. They threw him in jail for enough time to realize how to grease palms, and then he was expediently extradited back home, never to return to his beloved shaman. Following these Amos's initial footsteps, I made the same journey south into the jungle to find my answer in totality. That had been my introduction to Peru. This has been Chapter 2, Part 1 of In the Darkness I See by Anon Y.